Hello and welcome to exercise number 10, where we will talk about mean arterial pressure and the physiology behind that, or what we come to know as MAP. So MAP, mean arterial pressure, is a tightly regulated system. It's maintained by a negative feedback system. So we've talked about many negative feedback systems in the past. You'll recognize some similarities here, and you may also notice the specific parts of this. So the sensor for our MAP are baroreceptors, or mechanical receptors that are responsive to stretch. We find these in the carotid sinus and in the aorta. The integrator is our cardiovascular center in our medulla. So this directly impacts the autonomic, or this is part of the autonomic nervous system, and we'll talk about the effects of the two parts of the autonomic nervous system on MAP. And then the effectors are the heart, the arteries, the arterioles, and the large veins. So mean arterial pressure is the product of cardiac output, or CO, and total peripheral resistance, or what we call TPR. So let's define these two terms, just so we're clear. TPR is the total peripheral resistance. It's affected by the diameter of our arterioles. So basically, they can vasoconstrict, so the smooth muscles within our arterioles can contract, causing the diameter to get smaller. And if the diameter of a vessel gets smaller, then the pressure on that vessel increases, as long as the amount of liquid volume inside hasn't changed. They can also vasodilate, where they would get larger, the diameter would get larger, and that decreases total peripheral resistance, or the amount of resistance on the system by the arterioles. Next is cardiac output. Cardiac output itself is a product of stroke volume, which we abbreviate as SR, and heart rate, which we abbreviate as, SV, and heart rate, which we abbreviate as HR. So cardiac output, this is a measure of the amount of blood that's being pumped to the arteries. If we further define the terms that affect cardiac output, stroke volume is the amount of blood that's ejected by the heart in a single contraction. This is controlled by contractility and end diastolic volume, and we'll talk about those two things in a second, which is right now. Contractility is a change in the contraction strength of the heart due to more calcium present. This is something that's going to be affected by the sympathetic nervous system, so an increase in sympathetic activity would increase contractility of the heart. And then end diastolic volume, or what we call EDV, is the amount of blood in the heart at the end of diastole. So this will affect how much blood will be leaving the heart during systole. So another way to think of this is cardiac output is the amount of blood that's going into the arteries, whereas total peripheral resistance is the amount of blood that can leave the arteries, and it's in the arteries that we measure mean arterial pressure, or MAP. So if we look at this diagram over here, we have cardiac output coming in, we have blood going into the arteries, where we can measure the pressure there, or the MAP, and so long as these are not vasodilating or vasoconstricting, then we get normal flow through the system, and we maintain a constant MAP. If we increase the cardiac output, then that causes the mean arterial pressure to go up, so long as we don't affect the peripheral resistance, or the TPR. If we if we have a constant flow of blood, or constant cardiac output, but we vasoconstrict, or we increase total peripheral resistance, then that can also increase MAP, because even though the same amount of blood is getting into the arteries, less is able to leave at the same amount of time, and so that increases pressure on the system as well. And just in case you weren't clear, HR, heart rate, is the rate at which the heart is beating. So if we take a look at this, what we call the roadmap to MAP, where MAP is is outlined in red here. These are all factors that affect mean arterial pressure. And one of those is venous return, as we saw before. Now, there are actually 5 different ways that we can affect venous return, or the amount of blood that's going back to the heart through the veins. Notice that if venous return increases, that increases end diastolic volume, which increases stroke volume, which increases cardiac output, which increases MAP. So basically, if we look at any of these factors, if they go up, so too does MAP. Same on the other side here. If we increase total peripheral resistance, that can also increase mean arterial pressure, as we saw in the previous slide. And we'll talk about PPP, or peripheral pulse pressure, in just a minute. So the 5 ways that venous return can be affected include the respiratory pump. Basically, this is what happens when negative pressure is created in the thorax during inhalation. So if you inhale, it creates a negative pressure inside the thoracic cavity, which pulls blood towards the heart and increases venous return. Next, we have something called a skeletal muscle pump. This is the effect of skeletal muscles on venous return. So we can increase venous return by contracting our muscles. So if you were exercising, then literally the pressure that the muscles, as they contract and flex against the veins, can decrease their diameter and increase the amount of blood that's going to the heart. So when we exercise, we increase venous return. Next, we have something called venomotor tone. Venomotor tone has to do with the contraction of smooth muscles in our veins. So if we contract those and we constrict those veins, then we can increase the pressure on the blood going back to the heart and increase venous return. Next, we have blood volume. Blood volume is the amount of blood in veins, so if blood volume is higher, then venous return is higher, and then its effect on MAP is the same. The way that we can affect blood volume is, let's say, a transfusion. Maybe you can gain blood that way. Our kidneys also play a role in blood volume, and if we have an injury and we lose blood, then we can actually see venous return go down, and then we can see all of these things go down, like end diastolic volume, stroke volume, cardiac output, and then a decrease in MAP. And then the last is body position. So this is actually measuring the effect of gravity. If you've ever stood up too fast and got lightheaded, then you know what's going on here. But basically, if you stand up quickly, then that decreases venous return. And then once you sit down abruptly, that can increase venous return. So this brings us to our next point, which is the effect of the autonomic nervous system on mean arterial pressure. So if we're looking at this roadmap to MAP again, the sympathetic nervous system, it kicks in when mean arterial pressure decreases. So basically, if blood pressure goes down, the sympathetic nervous system kicks in to increase heart rate, so it directly affects heart rate. It can affect contractility, venomotor tone, and total peripheral resistance, and it does this by increasing these. It can increase heart rate and increase MAP. The parasympathetic nervous system, it kicks in when mean arterial pressure increases. So if our pressure is high, then that's when the parasympathetic kicks in, and the way that it affects or attempts to bring MAP back to normal, back down to normal, is by affecting the heart rate by decreasing it. So let's just go ahead and take a look at this map, this roadmap to MAP a little bit more. So we talked about the factors that can affect mean arterial pressure. So mean arterial pressure is what we're measuring. Then basically all of these other factors with arrows pointing towards them can affect mean arterial pressure either directly or indirectly. Where venous return, if any of these in this box increase, then that increases end diastolic volume, increases stroke volume, increases cardiac output, which then increases mean arterial pressure. None of those will directly have effect on total peripheral resistance, which is why it's on the other side of mean arterial pressure. If total peripheral resistance goes up, mean arterial pressure goes up as well. So we can assume if any of these other factors are directly affected, like heart rate, if heart rate goes up, cardiac output goes up, mean arterial pressure goes up. Or if any of them go down, let's say end diastolic volume goes down, that means stroke volume goes down, cardiac output goes down, mean arterial pressure goes down. Same with contractility, because it affects stroke volume. That's why it's positioned here. If it goes up, stroke volume goes up. If it goes down, stroke volume. Is the pulse pressure plethysmograph. So we actually looked at one of these before. This is where we put that little thing on the tip of our finger, and what PPP tells us is a measurement of the amount of blood flowing in our capillaries, or the pressure of blood in our capillaries, and it also tells us heart rate. So the effect that PPP doesn't directly affect mean arterial pressure, but it reveals an artifact of mean arterial pressure and total peripheral resistance. So if PPP is high, then that means mean arterial pressure is low and total peripheral resistance is low. If PPP is low, then that means that total peripheral resistance is high and mean arterial pressure are high as well. So it's important to know this because we will be looking at data from a PPP wave, and we'll need to interpret it based on whether it's decreasing or increasing. So what exactly will we be doing in lab this week? Well, for exercise 9, we are going to be looking at the results of blood pressure cuffs. So what we'll be doing is we'll be looking at data where there is a PPP wave, which, as I mentioned, measures the flow of blood in the capillaries. And we can assume that if the arterioles are vasoconstricting, then there's less blood getting to the capillaries and the PPP wave is small. But remember, if the arterioles vasoconstrict, then that increases MAP. So with a small PP wave, we have a larger MAP. And if the arterioles are vasodilating, meaning more blood is getting out of the arteries, then we see more blood getting into the capillaries, and we see an increased PPP wave, but that will correlate to a decrease in MAP. Excuse my awesome handwriting here. Also, for exercise 10, we'll be looking at PPP waves as well, and we'll be doing 2 exercises. The first is the Valsalva maneuver, or we'll be analyzing the results of 2 exercises. The first is the Valsalva maneuver, which the way this works is you essentially close your throat and attempt to exhale. And so what that does is it increases the amount of pressure in your thoracic cavity, and it should have the opposite effect of the respiratory pump that we mentioned before. So if it lowers venous return, that should lower MAP. But then we're asking you to tell us what's the expected response of the autonomic nervous system, what's the effect on the heart rate, and what should the PPP wave look like. Next, we'll be measuring the effect of changing body position, so whether somebody stands or sits. So remember, if somebody stands up, that lowers venous return and lowers mean arterial pressure. What do we expect the autonomic response to be? What effect will that have on heart rate? And what effect will that have on the PPP? The last thing I want to point out here is the type of data that you'll be looking at and some things to keep in mind. So these arrows up here, what they do is they highlight where certain parts of the experiment have been isolated. So for instance, this part right here between these 2 event points, this represents the baseline before the Valsalva maneuver. So if you click on those, it'll tell you what event that is up here. Also, if you're going to be measuring data, we can highlight the eye icon and then scroll over our data, which should appear down here as well. And then we can put that in our data sheets. So make sure you follow along closely and do your best.